Week 8, Lesson 4, Will Eisner and his contract with God. When looking at the most influential comic book artists in American history, two names always pop up. One of those names is Jack Kirby, the other is Will Eisner. It's been a very long time coming, but let's finally take a look at one of America's comic book greats. Will Eisner was born in 1917 and died in 2005 at the age of 87. He was a Jewish son of two European immigrants. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, to a very poor family and had to move around a lot as a child. As a teenager, he had a very athletic build, but didn't have the skills necessary to play sports on any significant level. His father was an artist who worked on painting sets for a theater. Will Eisner picked up his father's artistic talents. With the stock market crash of 1929 leading into the Great Depression, his mother insisted that he go out and make his family some money, even though he was only 13 years old at the time. He sold newspapers on the street and fought other newspaper boys for the best corners. This was Will Eisner's first experience with the newspaper industry. He studied for a year in the Art Student League of New York, which got him a job as a writer and cartoonist for the New York American newspaper. In 1936, at the age of 19, Eisner's high school friend, Bob Kane, the same Bob Kane that co-created Batman, suggested that he sell his work to a magazine called Wow, What a Magazine. There, he met up with an editor named Jerry Eager, who let him draw a strip called Captain Scott Dalton. Wow, What a Magazine only lasted 4 issues before folding. Eisner realized that most of the magazines were doing reprints of existing newspaper comic strips and needed more original content. With this in mind, Eisner met the then out-of-work Jerry Eager and suggested that he create his own studio to draw original comics in. Eisner would create the comics, Eager would do the promotions and management for the works. The studio was called Eisner and Eager, with Eisner's name first because he put up the money for the first few months' rent. There, they created materials for Timely Comics and Fox Comics, getting young talented writers and artists to come in and work for them. The most famous of the artists to get their professional starts here was a young adult who would one day be called Jack Kirby. Eisner and Eager was making a profit at about $1.50 a page, which would be just over $25 a page in today's money. In 1939, Will Eisner sold Eager his stock in the company and went off to write The Spirit. I've talked briefly about The Spirit in an earlier video, but we're going to explain some previously unmentioned information here. Remember that in 1938, Action Comics issue number 1 was released and created new interesting comics, and newspapers wanted to compete with that by creating their own comics. Will Eisner met with newspaper owner Everett M. Arnold, who is better known as Busy Arnold, and agreed to draw some comics for his papers. But Will Eisner insisted that they split the copyright of the character, with Eisner getting full control of the character if and when they finally split up. Busy Arnold agreed, and Will Eisner created The Spirit. This meant that Will Eisner was one of the very few Golden Age artists who actually owned his own creation. He had the money and reputation to give him some bargaining power, which allowed Will Eisner to retain all the rights once his partnership with Busy Arnold had ended. Eisner realized that it was mostly children who were reading comics, but both children and adults were reading newspapers. So he wanted to give comics exposure to a larger demographic. This is why The Spirit would occasionally do experimental layouts with its stories. It was to highlight what the comic book medium was capable of. As mentioned in the Week 4 video, Will Eisner was drafted into the military in World War II and began drawing propaganda posters and training manuals. In 1948, after the war, he founded the American Visuals Corporation. This corporation was created to design comic book manuals for the government and other corporations. He still worked on The Spirit during this time, but his focus was on the company, which is why we haven't talked about him in this course since World War II up until this video. In 1978, Will Eisner once again changed the comic book industry by creating A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories. This was a book with 196 pages of original drawings that told many stories about poor tenants in New York. The characters didn't interact with each other's stories, they were all just connected by the running theme of being poor. These weren't action-packed stories, they were not science fiction or superhero stories, these were stories that were about everyday individuals as they reached very important moments in their lives. The first is about a young Jewish man who makes a pact with God when he is a child. When he gets older, he adopts a girl, who dies. Upset, he throws his contract with God out the window, shaves off his beard, sells the bonds he was holding for members of his synagogue, and makes himself a rich man. Once he becomes rich, he returns the bonds to his synagogue with interest and demands that the synagogue members write him a new contract with God. The members protest, but he doesn't want to hear it. When he gets home, he reads the contract and promises to spend the rest of his life doing charity and trying for a family again. He then drops dead from a heart attack. The next story is about a street singer who goes from alleyway to alleyway singing and meets an ex-tenor who says she'll make him her new protege. He sleeps with her, then goes to the corner store and spends most of his money on alcohol. When he goes home, he beats his wife, almost kills his baby, and then goes to the bar to drink. At the bar, he realizes he forgot to get the tenor's address. He lost his chance to become famous and goes on with his miserable life. The next story is a short one, about a building supervisor, Mr. Scruggs. He had a mean-looking dog and thought that fear equaled respect. One of the tenants insists that he gets the hot water working for her niece, who was in her early teens. The niece follows him to his room, poisons his dog, steals all his money, and when Mr. Scruggs goes after her, everyone thinks he's about to rape the girl. The police come and Mr. Scruggs kills himself, while the girl gets away with his money. The final story in this collection is about a group of people who leave the city for a countryside vacation. I won't ruin what happens, but based on the previous 3 stories that I mentioned, you can guess that not everyone is going to have a good time. These were stories for adults. There was minor nudity, suicide, cruelty to animals, infanticide, theft, and the people committing the crimes would occasionally get away with it. The book dealt with mature themes like getting older, questioning religion, and living with bad decisions. This was adult. It wasn't using violence for the sake of violence like crime comics or horror comics were. It wasn't targeting children. They were stories that children probably wouldn't even be interested in. This wasn't the first collection of comic book stories released. Europe had released collections of comic stories in hardbacks they called album before this one was published. We already looked at the woodcut novels of The Sun and Godsman, which were books that told complete self-contained stories. In 1976, Jim Steranko did a comic called Chandler, Red Tide, which referred to itself as a graphic novel on the inside of the cover and a visual novel on the cover. There were even a few other collections of comics before that. Unfortunately, for them, none of them were a big hit with readers. Remember, when A Contract with God first appeared in 1978, comics were just starting to shake off the stigma of being a children's only medium that the rules of the Comic Code Authority were trying to force it to be. The only major successes in professional American comics in the past 2 decades by this point were superhero comics. Eisner's work came out at a time when the Comic Code Authority had loosened up enough that comics could tell more adult tales again, but all the major comic book publishers were too afraid to move away from telling superhero stories. When his work came out, it showed that comics could reach more mature readers, and that they would respond well to it. The book was a critical success, and was financially successful enough that decades later, Will Eisner would turn it into a trilogy. The term graphic novel was made popular by The Contract with God, and this gave the comic book medium a term that sounded more respected, and that simple change in terminology allowed the start of comics to become a more respected art form in America again. Will Eisner did not stop there though. In 1985, he released a book called Comics in Sequential Art, which deconstructed the art of comics, explaining the benefits and shortfalls of the medium. The book also coined a phrase which you've already heard me use in these videos: sequential art. The term sequential art was another tool used to make the art of comics more respectable by academic institutions. While there's no one absolute agreed upon definition for what qualifies as sequential art, it's a term used for art that tells a story or narrative through a sequence or series of images. It's not a style of art, but rather a form of art. If you look back at the previous videos, you'll notice that this is what we've been looking at in almost every video since Hogarth. Will Eisner would occasionally write a new graphic novel every few years and spent the last decade of his life lecturing students about the craft of sequential art until his death at the beginning of 2005. In 1988, In the San Francisco Comic Convention, they started up the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards in response to hearing that the previous Jack Kirby Awards were being discontinued in 1987. The Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards were shortened to the Eisner Awards, or even just Eisners. They are designed to recognize creative achievements in comic books. They are the comic book equivalent of the Movies Academy Awards, or Oscars, and these are named after Eisner. Eisner is also worth looking at because, unlike Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, he was just as much a businessman as he was an artist and writer, and was able to make more than a comfortable living doing what he loved. Will Eisner played a huge part in making comics a more respectable medium in America, writing one of the first books deconstructing the art form and creating terms to recognize the medium as a legitimate one. He used comic book techniques to create training manuals for the government and arguably wrote the first successful American graphic novel. He was so influential that the most prestigious awards in comics are currently named after him. Questions to contemplate. Based on what was discussed in this video here, what do you think was Will Eisner's single greatest contributions to the medium of comics? Jack Kirby and Will Eisner are usually seen as two of the most influential artists in the American comics. Between the two of them, which one do you think was the most influential individual? State your reasons.